It's time for Dialogue Conspiracy with political research specialist Mae Brussell, who for 3 years has shared with us her decades' research into political assassinations and abuses of power in this country. Her program relates the news of the week to emerging evidence about the conspiracy which allegedly maintains by force its control over the legislative and judicial processes in America. And now, here's Mae.
Good afternoon. This is Mae Brussell in Carmel, California. It's May 19th, 1975, and this is number 196 in Dialogue Conspiracy. I have an anniversary soon. It'll be 4 years since this program was first on the air. At the time of the Pentagon Papers exposures, I was invited to do a news broadcast, and that first broadcast was a linking of the John Kennedy assassination to the Pentagon Papers. And in those 4 years, history has proven many, many links related to the exposures of Daniel Ellsberg and to the White House plumbers trying to stop the leaks of the Pentagon Papers for Richard Nixon and the punishment of Ellsberg, and relating these same agents to the Kennedy assassination and to present conspiracies taking place. The news this week is filled with information about the John Kennedy assassination. The Associated Press carried a story confirming the fact that Lee Harvey Oswald had FBI number 179, an agent of the FBI who received $200 a month from the FBI. Another story carried by the UPI this weekend is the fact that there are two Lee Harvey Oswalds. The quotations were from Peter Dale Scott, a researcher in the Bay Area, and Jones Harris. And these subjects we have carried extensively on Dialogue Conspiracy through the years. Lee Harvey Oswald's doubles, and also the fact that he was an agent of the FBI. I'm thinking of starting a news service. Paul Krasner never got conspiracy newsletter out. I have some friends in the studio with me today who are thinking about helping me get a newsletter out, maybe bi-weekly, to mail out, and we're going to call it Tomorrow News Service. You subscribe to our newspaper as you listen to KLRB, and then tomorrow and in the future, you get the news weeks, years, sometimes 2 to 10 years later that you would be reading in the bulletins and newspapers that I want to get out. The Los Angeles Times has an interesting article this last Saturday, May 17th, 1975, on the SLA shootout, and the front page headlines read, "The case spawns theories of suicide and murder." This is a big story. It's 1 year since the murder of the SLA in Los Angeles, the Donald DeFreeze and the other members of the SLA. And this particular story goes into the new allegations. They're new for many people, they're old for researchers, that Donald DeFreeze did not choose death voluntarily, did not commit suicide. The original story was that the members of the SLA inside the house chose to die, burned to death, and that Donald DeFreeze shot himself. This is a very extensive article, and I'll try to outline it for you by next week, suggesting the possibility that DeFreeze was the double agent. That's what I wrote about in my SLA article. One possibility that he's not dead but escaped shortly before the fire took place. The confirmation of movies that I just saw this last week, that there was no bullhorn warnings at the house before they opened fire. The police claimed that there were clear warnings, and you see the movies and hear the men in front of the house, and there clearly was no warning. And Camilla Hall, it seems, emerged from a crawl hole and was fired upon by members of the SWAT team, Special Weapons team in Los Angeles. She dropped to the ground and was dragged back to the crawl hole. She wanted to exit. Nancy Ling Perry was fired at. They said that she had a gun in her hand, but it seems that the official report has no mention of where the gun was found or how close to her. The official report is filled with discrepancies, and the SLA is the CIA. That's what I believed a year ago. I believe it more than ever now. And next week I'll try to go into details 1 year after I completed my article on the SLA, and 1 year after this group were murdered, and show the events that have taken in the last year to confirm my original beliefs that this is a CIA operation. I'm not going to dwell on it at length today because there are a lot of other matters that are more pressing, but I'll do it next week. The U.S. Attorney's Office in Cook County, this is Illinois, said this week in a news report that one or more of the Watergators will be indicted soon for causing violence and terrorism in Illinois. They haven't mentioned who these people will be. I believe Hunt and Liddy are not to be indicted. They hinted it would be Jeb Magruder or possibly James McCord. But there were a series of terrors against the peace movement done by the Watergate team that were indicted at the time in June, that were entered into the Democratic headquarters, and also other agents hired by the White House that worked in the White House and with CREEP. And it seems that the CIA supplied military tear gas rounds and grenades that were fired as acts of terrorism. And one of those was the performance of the Russian ballet in Illinois. And this same terrorist group bombed a church where an anti-war meeting was held in the city of Elgin, Illinois. There's a religious writer, used to be with the San Francisco Examiner, who is a pastor, who now is a religious editor for Gerald Ford in Washington, D.C., and I will give you his name at another broadcast. I have his name here. He comes from the Carmel area. And I was given information that he had 2 churches in Seattle that he had burned down and bombed to blame hippies for being anti-religious, and that he was directly linked to James McCord. And I'm saving this information until a future date to have it investigated in Seattle, but I think the story coming out of Cook County now that the Watergators bombed the church gives you an indication that if those indictments come in, we can go further into that other investigation and see why this man is working for Gerald Ford in the White House as a religious editor for Gerald Ford. And he worked with the Watergators also on the West Coast. These indictments say that the CIA team specialized in hiring rowdies and bullies to break into civil rights movement, peace movements, and the cover was the Zenith Radio Corporation. The military intelligence, the 113th Military Group, was supposed to have been operating out of this office inside of a warehouse. Military intelligence used the Zenith Radio building, and it was called the Roland subsidiary as a front for their operation. I received this information and typed it up from Sherman Skulnick, who is a very great investigator living in Chicago, who did the extensive work on the plane crash of Dorothy Hunt in December 1973 when that plane went down in Chicago. And Sherman told me that the Watergators, the news came over, they were to be indicted. So in exchange for that information he gave me this morning on the telephone, I read to him a document marked secret, dated June 20th, 1972. This is 3 days after the Watergate arrest. This is a secret document, which I have a copy of, signed by Howard J. Osborne, Director of Security for the CIA. It is a memorandum for Acting Director of the FBI, that was Patrick Gray at the time, attention Mr. Arnold L. Parham, and the subject is Bernard Barker. And it goes into the biography of Bernard Barker, who was born in Cuba, moved to the United States, and began to be hired by the Central Intelligence Agency in April 1960. He was widely known among the Cuban exile community. Bernard Barker was the money man with E. Howard Hunt for the Bay of Pigs operation, and he was the money man with E. Howard Hunt for the Watergate operation, as well as the Gemstone operation, which included planning violence for the conventions down in Miami, which is now confirmed by documents that are in my hands. And Bernard Barker was funding the possibility of murders and kidnappings in Miami, as well as the entry into the Democratic Hotel, the offices at the Watergate Hotel, not the Democratic offices at the Watergate Hotel. Now, the document about Bernard Barker that was sent from Mr. Osborne of the CIA to the FBI said that he was terminated by the CIA on July 31st, 1966, to accept employment at the Roland Corporation, a subsidiary of Zenith Radio Corporation in Chicago, Illinois. That is a P.S. to the story breaking out of Cook County. And that is the kind of thing that I will put into my conspiracy newsletter called The Future News, is that it will take a long time for the investigations of people in Washington to link E. Howard Hunt and Bernard Barker and possibly maybe we'll find Mr. Sturgis in Chicago too. But I think we'll find the CIA funded the operation of the Chicago Convention riots in 1968. E. Howard Hunt, according to Mr. Skolnick, was behind the violence at the conventions in 1968, which also led to the lengthy conspiracy trial and coming down on radicals and following the assassination of Robert Kennedy, that bloody scene in Chicago. But we have now that Bernard Barker, who was employed always by E. Howard Hunt, he was his contact. Bernard Barker, according to the CIA, was in Chicago at the Zenith Radio Corporation, the subsidiary of it, the Royal Corporation, which, according to the United States Attorney in Cook County, was the fund for the CIA that supplied the tear gas grenades that fired into the Russian ballet, the performance, bombed churches, beat up people in the civil rights movement and in the peace movement. The United States government funding this, and that once again, from Dallas to Watergate, these names reappear over and over again. And now the important work for Mr. Skolnick or Alex Broaddus, people in Chicago, is to subpoena and ask for the bank records of Bernard Barker, his income tax, and his financing, what he was doing at the Zenith Radio Corporation. It's interesting how they changed jobs, because Frank Sturgis, his co-worker, CIA worker, also involved in the Bay of Pigs down in Miami, received a church himself. He became a minister just 2 weeks or so before the Watergate arrest, and the Internal Revenue, the tax system, gave him a tax deduction, and he became the pastor of a church, and he was an aluminum door salesman. And Bernard Barker was a banker and is a banker in Miami, linked to Bebe Rebozo and very many prominent names down the Miami area, but he becomes a radio man for Zenith at Roland in Illinois, at the same identical place where the CIA hides their weapons for the 113th Military Group. I did want to talk at length about an article, because I think it's historically interesting, that was in the Los Angeles Times by Mr. Terhorst. That was the press secretary of Gerald Ford, who resigned, and it's called Gerald Ford and Ted Kennedy Face a Dilemma. And it is filled with a lot of irony, and he goes into, this was April 28th, 1975, LA Times. Terhorst goes into the problem of Ted Kennedy, the agonizing decision of opening up his brother's assassinations. If he opens one, he'd have to open the other, and that would bring publicity, and it would bring out the kooks and the conspiratorial-minded fanatics. And then he goes into Gerald Ford's position. The deceased members of the Warren Commission wouldn't be present, and then he said it would be unseemly of Gerald Ford to do this work when the other members aren't alive. And then Terhorst goes on, speaking for Ford, of course, they're lifelong friends, that Gerald Ford feels that a presidential call for a new inquiry into the Dallas assassination would have implications and reverberations far beyond the merits of such action, and that Ted Kennedy might capitalize politically and on this, and then again Gerald Ford might use it. And the only solution that Terhorst suggests is that the only thing to do so that it wouldn't be political for Gerald Ford or for Ted Kennedy to look into it would be to devise, this is a quote, a responsible group, and this is a direct quote, to check into the Kennedy assassination. To be credible, he says, the membership of such an investigative body should be as far removed from politics as possible. Now, that is a very good suggestion of Terhorst, that to open this thing up, it should be as far removed from politics as possible. And I think of myself as a researcher doing 11 years' work on this subject and not intending to run for any political office and not funded by any political person, and having cross-filed the 26 volumes of Warren Commission hearings, I feel that people of my ilk should join, and maybe we have suggestions on who killed John Kennedy and Robert Kennedy. But it seems there's this intense fear of the people that are doing the investigation now, that are spearheading the drive that I've talked about on my various shows, to open up the assassinations. They're so afraid that if they open it up, that I call myself Typhoid May instead of Typhoid Mary. They're so afraid of the information that I've got, that they have decided that they will be the official spokesman. You see, Terhorst is leading the way when he says a responsible group. And who does he want to be the responsible group? Well, I've talked about that before, and I'll just briefly go into it for 1 minute. First of all, he says there'd be publicity the Kennedy family would receive. Well, they've gotten publicity every day for 11 years. Jackie and Ted and Robert before him and Joan and all of them. Ethel, they're on the front page of every magazine since Marilyn Monroe died. Nobody's gotten so much attention. You go to a magazine counter, any airport or drugstore, and all you see is the Kennedys. They've had it continuously for 11 years. The Kennedy family, it isn't the publicity that they get because it's opening up. They get publicity because they're not doing anything, and they're in the news walking around like a bunch of silent zombies. We can't depend on the Kennedy family for any support in opening an investigation, and I believe that the answer to why they won't do it is found in a little book you might want to order. It's by Frank Capel of Army Intelligence, P.O. Box 333, 45 Bay Street, Staten Island, 1, New York. It's called The Strange Death of Marilyn Monroe, and maybe you'll find out why the Kennedys won't do anything about the assassination. Walter Winchell, in May 24th, 1964, wrote a plea in one of his articles to save a particular girl's life. Her name was Marilyn Johnson, who he said had been terrorized for months by the same persons who caused Marilyn Monroe's death. And he referred to Mr. Wes Graff of the FBI, who was special agent in L.A., who knew this Marilyn Johnson, but Walter Winchell was writing about the death of Marilyn Monroe, and I think the answer to the Kennedy silence could be found in that book, if you want to order it. As far as Gerald Ford and the deceased members of the commission not being able to defend their lousy Warren report, Gerald Ford is the worst apologist for the Warren report outside of David Belland, who's the investigator for the Rockefeller Committee. He planned to write a book on Lee Harvey Oswald as early as May in '64, before the Warren Commission even finished. He commercialized off of that. He makes money off of it. MGM is making a 4 to 6 hour documentary, and CBS is making a movie on Ford's book. So he isn't remaining silent to protect his co-workers. He is an aggressive defender and gets paid for it besides. Yes, Terhorst is right. An inquiry would have implications and reverberations far beyond the merits of such action, but I don't think he has the right to decide the merits of such action, particularly since the president he's talking about was appointed and not elected by the same man who put him on the Warren Commission. Richard Nixon appointed Gerald Ford to the Warren Commission, and the Warren Commission is accused now of being a group of faulty persons covering up a long list of crimes. The worst is murder. Then there's perjury and falsified evidence, planting evidence, and a conspiracy to cover up. But the worst thing they're doing is murder. I think Gerald Ford should be impeached before we open these things up. I've said it before. Many murders are involved: the John Kennedy, Robert Kennedy, Martin Luther King. The United States government is run by a handful of criminals, and I'm going to read you a little bit about a secret government today that I mentioned in my first realist article, and I'm going to read it loud and clear because I think that what Mr. Terhorst and Gerald Ford are covering up are the fact that Richard Nixon and Gerald Ford are just puppets of Navy intelligence. Admiral Moore and General Cushman of the Marines, Patrick Gray was from Annapolis, and Robert Mullen, who ran the public relations firm, Robert Mullen from Annapolis, and many people from Navy intelligence who have funded brain control through Dr. Delgado at Yale, and have funded the aerospace industry, imported 652 Nazis after World War II, used their puppets, Nixon and Ford. These are the things that would be discovered if we opened it up. When Terhorst says a new inquiry would have implications and reverberations beyond the merit of such action, he's not to decide the merit. The conditions of the Warren Commission meeting, according to the testimony of J. Edgar Hoover, was that it was open for all times, and Gerald Ford was the one who made the conditions. So I don't think it's for them to decide, and I don't think it's for them to decide what is a responsible group. There are certain people that have surfaced very quickly. I mentioned them last week. Several weeks I've been talking about them. As assassination researcher, I've met a few of them. One time, George O'Toole, who just wrote the assassination tapes, Robert Groden, who came out with the Zapruder films recently, Dr. Cyril Weck from Allegheny County, the coroner in Pennsylvania, and Mark Lane, who I have met 3 times, and each time he said hello and walked out of the room. These are the responsible group that Gerald Ford wants to investigate. E. Howard Hunt testified at the Senate Executive Session, Watergate hearings, December 18, 1973, that he was part of a domestic operation division which was illegal in the United States. You might make notes and write to the Church Committee. This is December 1873 session. He said, we established field stations in Boston, Chicago, San Francisco, to name a few cities. And then E. Howard Hunt goes on to say that one of the fronts for the CIA was the David McKay Company from the CIA, a book publisher. Well, if you read George O'Toole's book, The Assassination Tapes, turn on the back of the cover, and he wrote another novel just last year, 1973, called The Agent on the Other Side, and it was published by David McKay of the CIA. Now, it is very interesting that a former CIA man is writing a book critical of the CIA, published by the CIA. Now, you have to ask yourself, what do you think is happening? I have a pretty good idea of what I think is happening, and I've outlined it for you before. But when the CIA says we're going to open up an investigation, and then they decide what is a responsible group, and more than likely they'll choose Ramsey Clark to be the Earl Warren of the next investigation, which they're pressing in Washington. Ramsey Clark was mentioned in the White House tapes. Richard Nixon was thinking of having him investigate the Watergate. They trusted him so much. So people like Robert Groden don't explain how they got this film from Life magazine, and George O'Toole doesn't explain why the CIA publishes a book about the CIA, and Mark Lane doesn't explain why he doesn't use information that's available about political conspiracies. And then you have to slow down the wheels that are opening up these investigations and do a little more research. I have an article here about, it's by Colson, Charles Colson, who worked in the White House. It's called Colson's Complaint, and I'll just read you a few words he says about Bob Woodward. Now remember, Woodward and Bernstein broke open the Watergate case for the Washington Post. They were the great newsmen that won the Pulitzer Prize. They used Deep Throat, who was Robert Bennett, the public relations man representing the Hughes Tool Company, and they brought Richard Nixon out, and they were considered the darlings of the liberal press. But this is what Charles Colson said. He said, Bob Woodward of the CIA is now subject to total blackmail by them. This is Mr. Bast who was interviewing him. Richard L. Bast was interviewing Charles Colson. Bast interrupted Colson and said he misspoke. He said Bob Woodward of the Washington Post is what he meant. And Colson corrects himself. And then he goes on to say that the CIA can show how through every story, how he won the Pulitzer Prize, and he got $2 million for a movie on the Watergate story that was fed to him by the Central Intelligence Agency, and that makes him a whore. Colson suggests the CIA could make Mr. Woodward, would you really like to tell the whole story of how you exposed the Watergate? We gave you everything you printed. We can show it. We have it all in our files. It makes Clifford Irving look like a goddamn saint. You want to be exposed as a whore. Then they go in to Seymour Hersh, who was a good friend of Mr. Colby of the CIA, and they give him information, and he only prints a little bit. Colson said, Bob Woodward, I find it deeply regrettable and saddening that Mr. Colson, who has pleaded guilty to smearing Dr. Ellsberg, is doing the same thing. This was a remark on the revelations of Colson about Bob Woodward, that he not only smeared Dr. Ellsberg, but that he is now smearing Bob Woodward and the Washington Post. But Colson represents another factor, I believe, which is bigger than the CIA, which is the Defense Intelligence Agency. I believe that's where Jack Anderson comes from. I believe Mr. Bennett and the Hughes Corporation come from there, and all of these books exposing the CIA, this rash of them by the CIA, former members dropping out, is to bring the CIA under control. The big fish are swallowing the little fish. The little fish is the FBI that is being eaten up by the CIA, and then the Defense Intelligence Agency will take care of the Central Intelligence Agency. And I believe that the investigation of the John Kennedy assassination is at a level that it's beginning to groundswell now is, from my point of research, is a very, very dangerous thing. I can't stop this kind of investigation now. There's a machinery that is going so powerfully strong and well-financed on every campus in America and very well organized to open this thing up now, and I think it's the same expression that'll catch on at the time of the Watergate hearings, and then an investigator will be brought in like Leon Jaworski, who was part of the team, and then the whole thing will be kept closed, such as the Watergate, where Watergate never got into the violence planned at Miami, the killings planned, the Howard Hughes connections, the Mullen Associates connections, the domestic CIA operations, the B.B. Rebozo connections, the Wallace shooting, the killing of Mary Jo Kopechne, and the links of the Boiler Room Girls to the CIA and Hughes Corporation. None of these things were investigated because the investigation was carefully narrowed to a few witnesses to make it look like we did a good cleansing job. The news story that broke this week on the wire services that I mentioned, that Oswald was an agent of the FBI, finally comes out. You know, it's a big story. As I said, I've had it for years. We've talked about it for years. But just to show you how things are covered up, I have a memorandum here from the National Archives. It's from Mr. J. Lee Rankin, the General Counsel for the Warren Commission, on the subject, the rumors that Oswald was an undercover agent. And we've read it on the air before. I have it marked. I've read it at KLRB. It says Oswald got $200 a month. He got number 179. That's true, and that's news, and the Warren Commission got it at their very first meeting. But on page 3 of the same memo, here's some more information, which I've also said on the air, but maybe the news service someday will pick this up. That on Friday, January 24th, 1964, at the same meeting, the chairman of the Warren Commission met with Attorney General Carr, the District Attorney Wade from Texas, the Assistant District Attorney Alexander from Texas, and Leon Jaworski and Dean Story from Texas. And they stated that Melvin Belli, the attorney for Jack Ruby, was familiar with the allegations that Lee Harvey Oswald was an agent FBI, and Wade stated that he was also aware of allegations to the effect that Oswald was an informant for the CIA and carried number 110669. Now, Gerald Ford writes a book that Oswald's allegations of being an FBI member at the first meeting were hushed up, but why does Gerald Ford leave out the fact in his book that Oswald also was a CIA member and that it was documented? And this is that kind of selective investigation that my coworkers, some of them, not all of them, are doing. Unfortunately, some of them are willing to go on a need-to-know little itty-bitty information, and that's why they're playing up the Abraham Zapruder film. I got word from New York that a group took a survey on the John Kennedy assassination, just a small one, 25 people. Should we open up and name names who was involved in assassination, or should we just ask questions? And 23 out of the 25 supposedly said, we won't name names, we'll ask questions. Well, you can see when I went to the Boston conference why that was a no-no, why I'm Typhoid May, because I'm putting the names on their lap. And soon we'll see a Gallup poll that says they don't want to know who again, but they just want to know what happened, but not who did it. And this is the kind of an incomplete job on the John Kennedy assassination that's going to take place that I will not be a party of, and I will continue to reveal the people who are covering it up and their documentations of, and as much as I can find out where they come from. Now, the last 15 minutes of the show today, and then maybe a full half of next week's show, I'm going to talk about a document and some information from Washington, D.C. This document is about an organization called Interprogress from Washington, D.C. And those of you who have my realist article, Why Was Martha Mitchell Kidnapped, written 3 weeks after the arrest at the Watergate Hotel, goes into the funding of a secret operation that is bigger than the United States government. I refer to it as a hidden government. My article, those of you who are familiar with it know that on page 27, I begin with an introduction of a very hidden secret government that exists in Washington, D.C. I said on page 29, two governments have existed side by side, one visible and one invisible for many years. And as the power structure gets more arrogant and sure of itself, the invisible government becomes more clear. And I went into the fact of the secret funding of the invisible government. Now, what I mean is that there's a government in Washington, D.C., that we pledge our allegiance to, that we elect, and there's a separate government. And I think for the next 15 years, you'll be studying this secret government. It'll take 15, 20 years to smoke them out. On page 30 of that same article, I go into the question of Robert Mullen Associates and Robert Bennett, this public relations office at 1700 Pennsylvania Avenue, down the street from the White House, and that Robert Bennett, who I did not know at the time was totally used tool company, had raised $10 million in money for Richard Nixon, secret money, into these dummy fronts that was separate from the Democratic or Republican money. It was CIA money for Richard Nixon's clandestine operations, which also funded Democrats and Republicans heavily. The one-party system was funded through this $10 million funnel. And I asked about these CIA funds and their connection to the White House and their connection to Richard Nixon. And then I went further into my article on Robert Bennett and Mullen Associates. And then I'm turning here to page 35 and page 34, because under funding, I talked about Robert Bennett and Mullen, public relations company, and their dummy fronts, and they're supporters of the American Dream Machine, they call themselves. And under it's page 34, under dummy front organizations, I listed some that were secret front organizations that planned to overthrow and control the country. One was McCord Associates. One was Emeritus down in Florida. McCord's was in Maryland. The third was Bernard Barker Real Estate Office in Miami. The fourth was Mullen and Company Public Relations. The fifth was Interprogress in Washington, D.C., run by Robert Bennett, who worked at Mullen. And then I mentioned the Allstate Investment Fund and the Pan American Aluminum Company that Frank Sturgis ran, and these were dummy fronts. Well, the one of those that I mentioned, Mullen and Company, and then under that, Interprogress in Washington, D.C., was a dummy front that I recognized 3 weeks after the arrest at the Watergate Hotel, in which I said, July 11, 1972, Robert Bennett, president of the public relations firm at which Hunt works, said their firm has an affiliate called Interprogress that is attempting to increase American trade with communist countries. And it goes into that this money could help overthrow Chile and the ITT. Now, I'm going to read you Interprogress because this is 3 years later. It's almost July 1975. And I have a document which a very good friend provided for me that is a selling point, a personal thing put out by Robert Bennett. It's about Interprogress Limited, incorporated under the laws of the state of Delaware. Now, this is in my possession, and it's 3 years after I mentioned Interprogress as a dummy front. The board of the directors of Interprogress is Robert Bennett, Mira Borick, Elizabeth Kalko, James Everett, William Heimlich, Arthur Hochberg, E. Howard Hunt, Lyndon Jones, Diane Konowalski, Earl Minderman, Robert Mullen, Edward Nair, J. Hutchinson Page, and Walter Slowinski. Now, all 14 of these directors must be thoroughly investigated. You don't have time to take down their names now, but next week I will spell them for you slowly and on the air. And they are the directors. You know Robert Bennett. He represents the used tool company and the ITT. You know Howard Hunt. And I'll go into the biography of Robert Mullen further. Now, this is what the Mullen Corporation puts out, Interprogress. They have a list of services which include, among other things, public opinion surveys, geopolitical surveys, and public opinion molding. But I want to run through here. They describe their aims. They said, we assist our clients, and I'll read you their clients, in projecting their aims and obtaining support for their aims with the most modern techniques of the public relations profession. Now, they explain what they do. They say, and this is Interprogress, that dummy front group that I talked about before, and I have documented that Mullen Associates has been a conduit of CIA since the 50s, and then from April 63 became a headquarter of agents of the Central Intelligence Agency across the street from the White House, and this is where E. Howard Hunt had his own phone and desk as well as in at the White House, and they all connected. This is what Interprogress is. These are quotes. free enterprise system, they said, remains the backbone of the economic growth and well-being of the United States. Capitalism, of course. And it is recognized that the federal government has become a virtual silent partner in management decisions. This is what they said. The federal government is a silent partner in management decisions. So Washington plays a decisive role in the events of the 20th century. And as the United States has taken on new dimensions, so has our firm enlarged its concepts, its staff, and service, which translated means that the invisible government that I talked about, that's side by side to the federal government, the ITT, the CIA, and the Hughes Corporation has decided through Interprogress and 14 persons at our Central Intelligence Agency that the federal government is a silent partner, that they direct and have enlarged their staff and services. And they said they have a strong background of high-level government experience at home and abroad, and their clients, they protect their clients' aims, and they support them with every modern technique that's available. Now, they use the publishing and broadcasting industry and center of New York City. They have immediate access, Interprogress, it says, to newspapers, magazines, radio, and television with a broad experience in government relations, newspaper, writing, and advertising. The document I have has the names of the particular board members of the board here, and then it has a blank to fill in, such as Robert Mullen, who's based in Washington, worked for Life magazine, and was director of information during World War II for the Anglo-American Information Committee, helped with the Marshall Plan, and has extensive operations in 25 countries around the world. Another gentleman was head of the War Information Service and in charge of federal communications and international communications. Another member of the board of directors, I read you their names, has been with Mr. Mullen since 1953 and active in Mexico City. Another director active in public relations, aeronautical, electronics, and financial field, has been a special representative for the state of California State Attorney General's office in Washington, D.C. Now, this document goes on to the CIA offices of Mullen and Company and the Hughes, ITT connections, and CIA of Mr. Robert Bennett. And this is a private office in Washington, D.C., a dummy front for the Central Intelligence Agency. And we have to ask ourselves, what is the Attorney General of California doing, being represented? That's Evel Younger. The Attorney General of California is directly linked to the Mullen Associates. This is the first document I have to the CIA offices of Howard Hughes in Washington, D.C. Now, the Attorney General of California, Evel Younger, was named in a lawsuit filed by Godfrey Isaacs and Theodore Chirac for covering up the assassination of Robert Kennedy. The lawsuit names a man, Thane Caesar, an employee of Lockheed, that we've talked about on these shows. And the links of Lockheed to Hughes and to Robert Bennett are more than, right now they're just circumstantial, but they should be investigated. But the one thing I know is that the Attorney General of California has no business being represented. This man has been a special representative for the state of California, for the State Attorney General's office in Washington, D.C. And he also is busy in Japan, among other clients in Tokyo, the Shibaro Electric Company, Yamachi Security Company. This particular person is very active in Japan, and I think of the links and connections of Colston Westbrook. Colston Westbrook is the CIA agent, operator from the Phoenix program, who is in Southeast Asia and in Japan, learning behavior modification and clandestine work for 7 years. He returned to California, and his assignment was 2 days a week at Vacaville Prison, forming the Black Cultural Association, where Donald DeFreeze took on the name of Sin-Q, the man who was to free the slaves. Our Attorney General in California, Evel Younger, is in charge of criminal investigation in California. He's in charge of the prison system. He was named as a witness. Donald DeFreeze wanted him in Los Angeles at a court hearing. DeFreeze was familiar with Evel Younger. Donald DeFreeze worked with Criminal Conspiracy Section, Los Angeles Police Department, that was formed after Special Unit Senator, where the chief investigator for the conspiracy to kill Robert Kennedy came from the Hughes Corporation. This can be documented. There are many, many links of Evel Younger to concealing the Robert Kennedy assassination and to the forming of the SLA in California, as well as many other pieces of violence that would fall into shape if this were investigated. But here you have a man in Mullen and Company, which is a CIA front, and you have one of the directors, a special representative for the state of California, State Attorney General's office in Washington, D.C. This inter progress dummy front that I wrote about in 1972 describes this link to the Attorney General. 1971, the book was put out. Now, who are some of the customers of this great inter progress, this dummy front? The American Automobile Association, the American Bar Association. Now, these are the things you various researchers that get this tape should be writing down, or write to me, and maybe if the Future News Service gets out, we'll get this to you. Which lawyers from the American Bar Association are funded or working with these dummy front conduits of money from the Hughes Corporation, particularly in the CIA? Because the same lawyers are always appearing at the conspiracy trials. Sirhan did not get a public defender, even though he was poor. He got Grant Cooper, who was delayed on the case because he was representing Mr. Rosselli, who was the man hired by Robert Mayhew and the CIA to kill Castro. It was another case that Rosselli was a defendant in, and Grant Cooper goes right from the Mayhew FBI CIA assassination squad. That's his defendant, and the person he's defending right to Sirhan, and he's the lawyer who tells the judge and jury that he's not going to say his client didn't kill Robert Kennedy. He did, but he wants mercy or life in prison, but he tells the jury that Sirhan killed Robert Kennedy, who in the American Bar Association is represented by Mullen Associates. Another tie is the Brazilian Government Trade Bureau, which has important links. Brazil was overthrown in '64 after John Kennedy was murdered. Another client is Columbia Presbyterian Medical Center, New York. It was out of Columbia Presbyterian Medical Center that Dr. Owen Latimer surfaced when no other doctor could get in the National Archives and see the autopsy reports of John Kennedy. Dr. Latimer got out this expensive, slick magazine that went into every medical journal. If you sent him a postage stamp, he'll return it with $2 worth of literature on the famous bullet 399 that killed John Kennedy. He's got a biography of John Wilkes Booth and Lincoln and compares it to Oswald and the Kennedy killing. And he sent me a packet recently, and I wrote back, Dr. Latimer, who funds you? Who pays for your books? You're the most highly financed doctor in the United States of America. I have a copy of the letter. I just wrote it about 3 months ago. And I said, you're sending this stuff all over the country. Who funds you? All of a sudden, and not coincidentally, Robert Mullen's associate represents Columbia Presbyterian Medical Center in New York City. Wouldn't we like to know who published Dr. Latimer's literature? It won't be hard to find out. Robert Mullen funded the Cuban Freedom Committee, the pro-anti-Castro Cuban group, and Oswald was linked to that. He met them through his anti-Castro Cuban front for the CIA. He was linked actually to the Cuban Freedom Committee. Lee Harvey Oswald was. And Mullen Associates represent the Mexican Government Tourist Bureau, and E. Howard Hunt domestically worked with the CIA from '62 to '66 illegally, spent several months in Mexico prior to the Kennedy assassination, as did all the other operatives, and the funding of the Mullen Company, Robert Bennett's company, to the Mexican money, the New York banks, the linking of these people to the Watergate, to the Kennedy assassination, would become much more clear if we had subpoena power to get to Washington, D.C. and investigate inter progress. Now that is inter progress. That's a sample of what they do. They see that the federal government, according to their own words, stays in hand. They represent their clients. As I say, and again, they say the federal government is a silent partner in management decisions. Maybe you've heard recently the reports that the federal government does play a smaller role than the large multinational corporations, and I think it's important to investigate those. I have another article here about the role of Mullen Associates and Eugene Martinez, Bernard Barker. I want to read various times on the programs. I'll be reading the information about E. Howard Hunt's links to Mullen Associates and Bennett's like I do every week. I have a document here with so much information. I don't want to put too much out today and go too far from the Bennett operation, because while the purge is going on to open the John Kennedy assassination, and 35 congressmen have now agreed to support the Gonzales Amendment, I think we should go first to the Watergate. That's what I keep saying. Go in to the illegal activity of using the Mullen Associates as a cover for domestic operations, the use of E. Howard Hunt, who had scramblers in that office that were put in by Hughes, and telephones that went from the White House to the Mullen, and ask why Interprogress or Mullen Associates, a private group that's set up in Delaware, USA, in quotes, to expand East-West commercial relationships, is messing around domestically. Their agents are messing around domestically. If they're doing East-West relationships, what are they doing with Columbia Presbyterian Medical School, the Dr. Latimer Surface Fund, or the American Bar Association? Interprogress is to represent the way they say they're set up to do. We should have a right now, because of these exposures, to find out which lawyers were associated. Are they Ramsey Clark? Are they Percy Foreman? Is there Melvin Belli? Is there Grant Cooper? Who are the lawyers that are linked to the Hughes Corporation that are involved? If they are involved in the political conspiracies, we have a right to know. If they're men like David Bellin, we have a right to know. The lawyers on the Warren Commission were selected in such a secretive way that it's locked up for 75 years to know how they were associated. Were they linked to this office? Well, this is just one example of research that is coming home now. I mentioned Interprogress as a dummy front. Now you see what they do and how they're set up, and we'll do investigative work on the board of directors and continue to find out who really runs the government and see if that office or those kind of people run the United States government.
This has been Dialogue Conspiracy with political research specialist Mae Brussell, who for 10 years has been researching the facts behind political assassinations and conspiracies in this country. Dialogue Conspiracy originates with KLRB FM in Carmel, California.